Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate the continued support. This is our 50th episode, so a round of applause for that, and a huge round of applause for you guys as well. This content would not be possible without every single, viewer and sub that we have, and it's crazy to think that we've come along, this far to 50 episodes already. But before we really get started with today's content, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast. Helps us out more than you know. And today's content is really about teams that are kind of under the most pressure this offseason. And I feel like there's a lot of them, but we kind of picked and chose the ones that I think were the most intriguing and the ones that we're kind of more familiar with. And we're gonna kick it off with some honorable mentions first, ones that we're gonna kind of lightly talk about, and then the other ones we'll get more in depth with. Um, and my first one, this is more of a team that's kind of in a bit of a pickle. It's the New Orleans Pelicans. They had a injury riddled season last season, and it was really bad. At the beginning of the season, they were one of the top teams in the NBA. With everybody healthy, Zion was on a tear. Ingram looked pretty good. So did McCollum as well. So it's kind of interesting to see the turn that their season took just due to injuries. But they had some other problems that I think they needed to address, and they've somewhat addressed them in the draft. Shooting was a big problem that they had overall. I think and I think their fans definitely wanted them to bolster their shooting because I feel like their defense was okay. Not the best at times, but enough to get by and be a really good team at the beginning of the season. But yeah, overall, I think they did a good job in the draft. They selected Jordan Hawkins, 14th overall, great shooter, and they signed the undrafted guard. I think his name is Landers Nolly the second, Noli Nolly. Can't remember how you say his last name, but he's pretty good. So they definitely did bolster up their shooting stats. And I think that's what their fans wanted them to do. Um, the problem is, I feel like the last season, they did allow the highest opponent rim accuracy in the entire league. So that's pretty bad. And as for a shooting team, they finished 23rd in 3-pointers. So once again, pretty rough. So they have addressed some of their problems, but another thing is they need to decide what they're going to do with Zion, I think. And really Ingram as well. But, there were rumors floating around that Zion was going to be available for the trade, and that kind of just fizzled out immediately. So it seems like they're going to stick with him. It's just what can they do to improve his health, get better people around him? Because, obviously everybody knows about the off the court stuff. We're not going to delve into that. But, there is a need for guidance in terms of taking care of his body and extracurriculars for sure. So yeah, that's kind of really all I have to say, except for one more thing. They do have to address, I think, some free agency questions as well. They do have, their full mid-level exception and biannual exception to play around with, and I guess try and acquire some, I guess, more rim protection. I think that's one thing that they definitely are missing in terms of that 5 spot. So maybe, somebody who can bring in, maybe they can bring in somebody who can pressure the rim, but I feel like that's kind of a different story for another day. Um, but in terms of what they've addressed, I think they've done a good job in terms of you know bringing in some shooters that can give Zion and Bi some more space to work with in the upcoming season. Um, and it's like I don't know, the Pelicans, they're rough because we know what they can be when they're healthy. The problem is they're never healthy, so that's why I think they're under a lot of pressure because we did see them in peak performance, in the beginning of the season for 2023. But now it's like, are we going to see the same old story where it's like, Zion goes down, then they just lose pretty much every game and finish around that 500 mark again, and then they're a playing team. So, they do have some questions in terms of, I really want to say Zion, and it's like, we were talking about it before we even went live. Like, this is more of a case where Zion is under a lot of pressure, more so than the Pelicans. But nonetheless, I think, basketball is a team sport, so they do have some things to figure out, like I said, with the rim protection and stuff like that, rebounds. But overall, I think they do need a lot of work. But that's one of my honorable mentions.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one. I mean,
Yeah.
again, like even though they're in a somewhat different situation from some of these other, top tier teams
Hmm.
where, it's a younger team,
Right.
at the same time, because they have such high end level talent, like you said, there's definitely some pressure to win right now. We know what happened with Zion over the course of this offseason and just, his struggles to stay on the court.
Yeah.
We know if he can figure that out, he can be one of the most impactful players in the game. But, again, for right now, that's almost in a way kind of a theory because it's so much, so much of it is based on, like I said, his health.
Yeah.
because again, we know he's, only had one season where he's played more than 60 games, and outside of that,
Right.
he's, barely played over 30.
Yeah,
So
it's not looking good for them.
yeah, so a lot of the team's woes, I think, can be fixed obviously by a better roster, but also just can you get more games with Zion and Ingram? Because that's
Right.
really the biggest issue, I think. They did overhaul their training staff, I guess, but
Yes.
yeah, but like you said, at the same time, it probably would be nice if they could, figure out what do they really have, because we know like they have some solid players, right? Like Herbert Jones,
Mhm.
Trey Murphy, right? Those young guys really helped them out. But then at the
Yes.
same time, right, like the McCollum trade seemed like it was fine at the time, but he's been a little bit more up and down, and
Sure.
is he a guy that you really want to give max money to, for several more years? I mean, yeah, you could say that, but at the same time, again, there's kind of a ceiling with that. So
Yes.
but
There's
I definitely do think
limitations.
there's, yeah, there definitely is pressure because again, the GM Griffin, right? You know, when he was first hired, right? Most people thought he did a pretty solid job, right? And then it seemed like it kind of turned south, right? And then they make that deal 2 seasons ago, right, where they get to the play in and then the playoffs, and they lose to the Suns in six, and
Yes.
then like you said, they had this season where they're one of the top teams and everything was looking great, and then all the injuries hit them. So yeah, there's definitely pressure there. But like you said, an honorable mention makes more sense because there's not
Right.
quite as much as some of these other teams, just
Yeah.
because age wise they're in a different tier, and like where what people's expectations are.
Exactly.
Because they're this going into this season, they were looked at as like the Grizzlies the year before, right? Where it's a young team taking the next step, but not a young team that's like this team needs to win a title,
Right.
right now, or else the season's a failure, right?
Yeah.
Like they kind of just need to be a good team first, which they haven't necessarily been just yet.
They've been okay, but they have the potential to be great.
Yeah, for me, for my honorable mention, I had the Blazers. I mean, I know that's kind of a hot one,
Mhm.
as a primary one, but like also I don't feel like there's a whole lot the Blazers can really do, to actually really be, a legitimate contender. Obviously,
Sure.
we know Lillard is awesome. He had a great year, last year averaging over 30 a game, 7 assists, 37 from three, so one of his best seasons statistically, right? But the
Right.
team was 33 and 49, right? They missed the play in. Obviously, they were kind of tanking towards the end, and they were able to make something out of it because they got the third pick, drafted Scoot Henderson. So they have an interesting combination of young guys, right, with Scoot, with Shaden Sharp, with Simons, Nasir Little, right, Matisse Thybulle, right. But then after that, you also have some other guys, right, like obviously Lillard as a veteran, Jeremy Grant. You got to figure out what you do with him in the
Right.
offseason. Free agent looking for a big contract. Nurkic, right, who before he broke his leg was a really productive player, but he just hasn't been the same since then. Um, so like for me, I guess the biggest pressure for them is more so like with Lillard, right? Because we know that if they don't put together a team that he thinks can win, there's a potential for him to finally ask,
Right.
out for, and get traded somewhere else. But like I said, I only had them on as an honorable mention because I just don't really feel like there's a pathway for them to really do that. So I feel like it's ultimately going to come down to whether or not Lillard decides to ask for a trade, and we'll kind of find out, right? Because again, he's at a point in his career now where he's got all the individual accolades, like we mentioned with Jokic going into the
Yes.
playoffs. But now he just needs to get that title, right? Can he
Yeah.
be the best player or one of the best players on a title team? Um, I don't feel like there's like a ton of teams that could realistically trade for him, like in terms of like giving stuff up that Portland would want. I think Miami is obviously, one that people tend to think of the most just because they actually have, some stars on there.
Sure.
Brooklyn is another one where it's interesting because, that was a team that he mentioned
Mhm.
in a podcast that he would like to go to. But they don't have as much talent. It's more so about the picks that they can give back,
Right.
to Portland, right? They have, all of Phoenix's picks or a bunch of Phoenix's picks, as well as I think some Houston picks. So
Yes.
they have picks to give out, but not as much talent. But like I said, I think for them, they're an honorable mention because I don't see a pathway for this ending other than Lillard either asking out for a trade or just staying in Portland, despite knowing that they're going to be a mediocre team.
Yeah. I agree. I feel like they're like one of those teams where it's like they're not under pressure to like contend. They're more so under pressure to commence the rebuild. That's what everybody's kind of waiting for. They're waiting for Lillard to
Choosing.
exactly. They're waiting for Lillard to move, and that's clearly what's going on. With Scoot falling to three, which I'm still surprised about. Um, that's kind of like the first. catalyst for them to even start this thing. Now you have Scoot, who's arguably one of the second best player in this draft. Um, and he's a ball dominant guard, and it's like, can he really share the backcourt with Lillard, who's known more for his scoring? So it's like, that's kind of a thing, and Lillard already expressed multiple times he doesn't want to be on a rebuilding team. So if that's the direction they want to go in, then they need to move swiftly with this Dame thing. And I think there's probably a lot of um you know heat behind the Lillard rumors, because I feel like a lot of teams want him, and I'm curious to see where he goes. And it's interesting. It's not necessarily the same situation as Bradley Beal, because Beal had the no trade clause, but I feel like Portland's gonna do right by him and send him where he wants to go. They're not gonna pull a Kyrie and like send him to a team that he didn't necessarily want to go to. They're gonna send him to his preferred destination if that's even possible or reasonable. So I think that's what they're under pressure to do, is definitely move Lillard for sure, more so than contend. So I agree with you on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and just kind of like as like a mini extra one, I also
Hmm.
had like the Lakers as an honorable mention, just
Sure.
like only because you have LeBron and AD.
Right.
We know the core itself has already won a title, but we just know that they're under pressure every year,
Yes.
because of the star power. But I didn't really want to spend time on that one
I
because
get
I
you.
feel like that's kind of like an easy one.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
Lakers. I mean, they're kind of like like I guess face of the NBA sometimes. They're one of the most recognizable teams, outside of what, like the Warriors and the Celtics. So it's like,
right.
when you have a franchise like that, a winning franchise, and you've had all those stars come through there, the expectation is you win games and get to the finals. So I agree with you on both of those. And now to get into like the real gritty stuff, this is where we're gonna go really in depth. And we each have three, so that gives you, what the number that we're looking at here. And I think I'm gonna kick this one off, and I think I might have the team that has the most pressure going first, and this is the Phoenix Suns. Um, the expectation here is honestly championship or bust at this point. Um, now you've gotten rid of Chris Paul, so and the trade is done, the deal is done. Now Beal, Katie, and Devin Booker are on the same squad. It's a lot of star power. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of stuff going on in this team. It's a stunning big three, at least on the offensive end. And, this is a win now move. And the danger with win now moves is the expectation is a championship. So they're under pressure to win the championship no matter what, pretty much. They've went all in. They have no future in terms of draft picks. So if this goes down, and they don't win in the next 2 years, honestly, next year, I'm gonna say next year, it's gonna look rough for them. It's gonna look like a disaster. And the question is, with some of these guys' health, can KD stay healthy? Can Beal stay healthy? We know that they're great players, but in terms of the health, how much production are you going to get with them? And with KD, it's a little interesting because it seems like now that he's gotten up in age, he's more vulnerable in terms of his durability. Which, I mean, that's kind of to be expected. You see it with LeBron, even he's missing more time, so that's not necessarily like a knock on Kevin Durant himself. It's just a knock on going all in on these guys. And the problem is, adding Beal to, the roster with Booker and Durant is great, but it doesn't address their depth issue. I think that's the thing that people are focusing on a lot, and I think that's the right angle to take because, I mean, the depth is really rough because, it's they're keeping Aiton. I think that's one of the rumors that came out. So Aiton's there. Um and they sent Chris Paul and Landry Shamet away. So that's already two guys that are pretty key in your rotation, I think. Um, and it's just rough because, I mean, what can you really do with a squad that is swallowing up all this money, and then also you have no bench? It's like, think about it like this. If you're playing 2K, you sometimes have those historic teams where you have the great players, but then you have a bunch of 60 overalls. And I'm not calling, the guys on the squad 60 overalls, like Jordan Goodwin. That's a great
Right.
acquisition. He's a great player. Um, but at the same time, how much depth is that going to give you in terms of replacing the value that you're losing when some of these guys aren't on the court? When Beal's not on the court, when Katie's not on the court, what is it going to look like? And we saw in the playoffs that this team flamed out hard. They got tired. They just couldn't compete because they had been playing all those minutes and even played mediocre against the Clippers that were hobbled. So it's it's just rough because the availability. I'm worried about the availability and depth, but like I said, it's championship or bust for them. And Beal hasn't played more than 60 games since 2018, so that's already a kind of a red flag. Durant hasn't played more than 55, since the Achilles injury in the finals. And I think Booker even missed a good chunk of this past season with like a pretty hefty groin injury.
He
Um,
wasn't all NBA or an all-star.
exactly, like and he had a pretty good season in my opinion. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like there's it's funny because I feel like they're like uberly talented like question marks, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily hear, considering the three guys that we're even talking about here. Devin Booker's proved himself to be one of the best scorers in the game. Same with Beal and same with KD. A lot of people have KD, as one of the best scorers of all time, but it all comes down to that health. And it's really like interesting. Like if you look at Denver, right? Because I feel like now instantly it's Denver and Phoenix that are kind of like butting heads and being like the top dogs in competition in the West. But it's also an interesting juxtaposition on how to build a championship team. If you look at Denver, look at what they were able to accomplish, with a set rotation of maybe like 8, 9, 10 guys. But then in Phoenix, it's going to be maybe 3 or 4. So that's the thing, and it seems like Phoenix is. I don't want to say they're rushing it because they did a lot. I think people are kind of forgetting what they've also done because they fired Monty Williams after 2 seasons, gave away depth and talent to bring in KD. Then you bring in Beal as well, while also losing a little bit of depth and veteran experience with Chris Paul. So I don't know. This is interesting, but at the same time, this is also what you see when there's a new owner in town as well. Sheba, he's the new owner, so I feel like he's kind of just flexing at this point. But at the same time, I don't want to compare them to Denver too much because they are two completely different teams. But I think they're the top two teams in contention in the West for sure. But like Denver is so much more patient. Um, you know, Malone was there for what, like 8 years?
7, 8.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like, it took him 8 years to get this championship for Denver. So I feel like Phoenix is rushing this a little bit. They with Denver, they were very calm and poised. They didn't rush to any judgment on Jamal Murray. I know there were question marks about if he was ever even going to return to the Denver Nuggets in general, just because of the ACL stuff and the rough start as well. So I don't know. This is rough. I feel like this is going to be a season where we're probably going to see them build chemistry, but that's not enough to satisfy me as a Kevin Durant fan, and I feel like NBA fans in general with this star power. So it needs to be championship, and that's why I have them as my number one team.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because again, when they made the Durant trade, at the deadline, this past season, right,
Hmm.
they were kind of vaulted in a lot of people's eyes, sort of as the favorites in the Western Conference, right? Because
Right.
at the time, nobody really had not as many people had like a clear view of who the best team in the Western Conference was. We knew there were a lot of good ones,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, with this move, yeah, it's definitely. I mean, it already was championship or bust, but now it's kind of like I think people would have given them somewhat of a leeway last year because you only had a couple months,
Sure.
right? But with this one, with the Beal trade, and then the offseason, it's definitely championship or bust time now. Because like you said, with the Suns, right, they went to the finals in 2021, right? Then had pretty disappointing ends in terms of in back-to-back seasons, right, where you get bounced out of the arena basically after a quarter and a half in Game 7 against Dallas, right? And then this past postseason, right, they get bounced out, right, basically in one quarter in Game
Right.
6 against Denver.
Right.
Um, so obviously, like you said, then they fire Monty Williams. They go out and get Beal after moving on from Chris Paul. And like you said, it's a win now move. It has to be, right? Because with all those picks, they don't have a draft pick, I think, until 2031, basically.
That's
So,
bad, man.
if you
Their
look at your
future is
calendar,
done.
yeah, if you look at your calendar, I mean, that's basically 8 years of not really being able to build through the draft, right? So that means that you have to really hit hard on those minimum
Yeah.
contracts, which is not very easy to do.
Right.
We know that there will be, some guys that will be interested in going there. But still, right, you still need a little bit more than that. But, you know, in fairness, though, right, there is no one way to build a championship team, right?
Yeah.
Denver, won a title, right? But then you look at the last five championship teams, and they're all relatively different, right? Like the Lakers when they won the title in 2020, right? That was a team that they basically put together,
Yeah.
that year, right? And then they ended up winning the title that year. I mean, there
Right.
were some holdovers, right? Because LeBron was there the year before. Guys like Kuzma, Caruso, KCP, they were there already, right? But it wasn't a team with like a ton of homegrown talent,
Sure.
like Denver. Right, Golden State, was kind of an interesting one, right? Because they had mostly homegrown talent, right? Obviously, Wiggins wasn't, right? But most of the
Hmm.
other guys, right? Steph, Clay, Draymond, Looney, Poole, right? All those guys, were guys that they drafted and developed,
Right.
right? You look at the Raptors, right? They were kind of a team that was sort of a mix of guys, right? Like you had Kawhi, who was, not homegrown, right? Because they traded for him, right? Danny Green, Marc Gasol. So every team is different, but definitely this team has to, at least get to the conference finals, next season, right? Or else it's definitely going to be looked at as a failure. Because again, you have too much star power up at the top, right? To,
Right.
come up short again, right? And, like I said, they got some leeway, right? When they went to the finals and lost the first year, because it's like, there's no shame in losing to Giannis. Um, and you didn't have the best player on the floor anyways, right? But now for most of these series, in theory, you should have, the best player on the floor for most of these series, right? Maybe
Right.
not every single series, but for most of them, you would think so, right? Or at least some, a guy that can basically be the equal
Sure.
for a lot of these. So that's kind of how I look at it from that
Yeah.
perspective, right? And again, there's a lot of the individuals are under pressure as well, right? Like say with Kevin Durant, right? Because this is another, team that he's been able to kind of assemble and put together. So he's got, and again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with
Right.
that.
Right. I get
Um,
you.
but at the same time, right, like that's a lot of pressure because again, like people are going to start looking at him like, you've played with a lot of talented guys, right, and you haven't really done much since Golden State.
Sure.
Right, even a guy like say obviously we know with Booker, right, he's elevated himself, but even with Beal, right, because Beal now is under more pressure because now he's going to be on a team, that has a
Absolutely.
legitimate chance to win, and obviously people know who he is, right, but they may not necessarily have seen a ton of him, in terms of what he can actually do on the
Sure.
floor, right. So this is kind of his chance to show, that he's not just a guy that's just putting up big numbers on bad teams, that
Right.
he can actually contribute to a winning team.
Right.
Um, Aiton is kind of an interesting factor as well, right? Because there's potential for him to stay, right? And if he stays, obviously he's going to be under some pressure, right? Because he's the guy that's kind of been bullied and picked on for a while. Or obviously there's pressure on him being potentially moved. So I think
Right.
there's pretty much pressure from all sides. Obviously, like you said with the ownership, same thing, right? With Matt Ishbia, right? Again, he's the new guy in town, putting together this big team, spending a ton of money, right? Obviously he's got the money to do it,
Yeah.
right? At the same time, also Isaiah Thomas is one of his friends, right? And reportedly, he's kind of a guy that's been advising all these moves, right? So there's definitely a lot going on here. So I think that's definitely the number one pick, which makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
because again, like if this doesn't work within the next 2 seasons, right, you're gonna be in a lot of years of pain where you're basically,
Yeah.
paying out, everything to all the
Yeah.
other teams, right? As the Wizards and the Nets basically kind of just, get richer,
Yeah.
right? While the Suns kind of just fall off. So
Yeah.
they need to win it either next year or the year after that, right? Because
Sure.
I just right, going forward after that, right? Then you got Durant who's going to be, like 35,
Hmm.
36, 37. Um, Beal's going to be in his 30s and like you said he's already missed a lot of time before even turning 30.
Right.
So I feel like it has a short window.
It's
But
small.
at the same time again, it's going to be interesting cuz we've never really seen a team put together in this exact way. So I'm really curious to see how it works where you basically have four max guys and not really much else, right? Because even
Right.
with the Warriors, when they had Durant, right, they had other guys outside of their core. Um, I guess with Miami, you had three max players and then not much else, right? But it was a different league. Now there's much more talent. So it's a lot harder, I think, to assemble these type of super teams. But again, it'll be interesting because they're kind of going back and forth and going at it with the CBA because the CBA was almost kind of designed to kind of prevent these type of teams from being put together, right? But Phoenix was able to do that. So we're
Yeah.
gonna we're gonna see like whether or not how effective the CBA is as well.
Yeah. Exactly. I had one more point to add, and then I'll let you talk about one of your teams. Um, this just popped into my head. Frank Vogel is going to be Booker's sixth head coach too. So, like I said, that kind of goes back to the point. It's a very impatient squad. Booker, KD haven't played a lot together. Neither played with Beal. And they kind of, in my opinion, prematurely sent out Cam Johnson and McCall Bridges, who I feel like had a ton of potential to grow together, um, with and maybe even become potential future Phoenix stars, and have like a really solid chemistry fueled group, where they could have taken the steps that Denver took as well. So and both teams are obviously vastly and overwhelmingly talented, but at the same time, it's just different. It's just interesting to see the difference in principle here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So for my team, my first team, I have the Dallas Mavericks. So this one, I think there's a lot of pressure for Dallas. Obviously, he just came off of a losing season. They were 38 and 44. They have a top 5 player, right,
Hmm.
in Luka Doncic, right? Obviously young guy, right? But still, when you have one of the best players in the league, you're under a lot of pressure, I think,
Yes.
to win. Obviously, we know the issues with the team, right? They went to the Western Conference Finals, the season before, right? So in a way, they kind of overachieved, and then this year they definitely underachieved, right? Where they were kind of a mediocre team for a little bit, then they got a little better, right? And then, they obviously traded for Kyrie Irving right
Mhm.
after losing out on Brunson, um, and then it just didn't work, right? It's not like it's not necessarily that Kyrie played poorly, or that Kyrie and Luca played poorly. The team just wasn't good enough, right? They were
Right.
missing a lot on the defensive end. Obviously, if you look at their defense, right, they were one of the worst in the league. They were 24th in defensive rating, right? If you look at exactly, yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
bad,
it's rough,
right? If
man.
you look at rebounding, right, they were 30th basically dead last in rebounding,
Yeah.
total rebounds, right? So that's just not good enough. Obviously we know the type of players that they need, right? They needed some more size, more capable bigs. They tried to correct that. They got Derek Lively
Great
in the
pickup.
draft, right? Everybody was kind of wondering what they were going to do with that 10th pick, right? And they ended up trading down to 12. Um, and drafting Derek Lively,
Smart move.
right? And then they also, yeah, exactly. And then they got out of the Davis Bertans contract, right? Brought in Rashawn Holmes, who had been out of Sacramento's rotation.
Right.
So we'll see what he does in Dallas, right? But it's kind of an interesting thing how that guy used to, be a starter for Sacramento, and
Right.
then the Kings have been a better team. He hasn't played at all. But regardless, right? You got Derek Lively, you got Olivier Maxence Prosper, right? So two young guys that I think most people overall liked those picks.
Yeah.
Uh, but at the same time, right, you also have some other questions, right? Kyrie's a free agent. We're assuming that they're going to re-sign him and give him a pretty hefty contract. I don't know if they're going to give him the complete max.
Right.
Um, but after that, again, you got to see, if you can use one of those exceptions, to sign somebody a little better than the minimum. But again, there's a lot of pressure, right? Because again, with Jason Kidd, right, in his first year, they did really well, right? Like I said, they got to the conference finals. But last year wasn't very good, for pretty much anybody involved, right? So that's kind of something that you got to see, right? We've heard about, Luca this offseason, apparently he's been, kind of working out, getting in better shape. So we'll see what that looks like.
Hmm.
'Cause I feel like a lot of times, there are times when it's legit and then other times where it's not really all that legit,
Right.
because again, you've seen like, the Simmons off-season workout videos, right? And those don't really go anywhere. Um,
Yeah.
and he's not the only one, but
Sure.
regardless, um, but definitely because they have a superstar guy, one of the best players, um, you gotta find ways to win, right? And they weren't good enough last year, and I feel like you're kind of playing a dangerous game if you have two back-to-back, poor seasons in a row,
Right.
right? Because I still feel like they made some decent moves. I feel like some people might be split on whether or not they're actually good moves, but I still feel like regardless, they need to do more. If they really want to compete with these other teams, right? Like it can't just be bring back Kyrie, you brought in Derek Lively and Rashawn Holmes, and now you're cooking. Like you're not there yet.
Yeah.
And if they have another bad season, then you're kind of in a you're kind of asking yourself, is it possible that Luca, could be in a position where he's kind of frustrated and maybe he asks out? So obviously, like I said, there's a lot of pressure for Dallas because again, you can't let this guy leave your squad, right? Because then you're really in trouble. And I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but like I
Sure.
said, just because you have a superstar and you're under a lot of pressure to win, you got to figure out what you do there. So they need rebounding, they need more size. They kind of addressed, I guess, their big man problems, right? But
Hmm.
you still need better guys at the wing. Those aren't super easy to acquire, right? Because we know those guys don't come cheap. But again, they got to figure it out because, like I said, if you don't, then you're in a position where Luca might ask out, and one of the top 5 guys in the league that you had that you drafted, you don't have anymore, and then you're basically a basement dweller for
Right.
a long time. So,
Yeah.
Dallas, I think, this is a really big offseason coming up for them. They can't mess this one up because they definitely bungled last year's, right?
Yeah, it
Letting
was
Brunson walk
horrible.
really and replacing him, with Christian Wood, right? Who, again was okay, right? But clearly he wasn't good enough that they want to keep him, right? Because there's a lot of reports that suggest he's gone, right? So
Right.
you basically let Brunson walk, gave up stuff, not a ton, right? You bought Christian Wood relatively low, but you're letting him go, right? So basically, you got literally nothing out of Jalen Brunson,
Right.
and you ended up overpaying, or not overpaying, panicking to make the Kyrie decision. So you can't have an offseason like that again, because that was already a pretty disastrous offseason, and one more like that, and you're pretty close to being done. Because after that, there's not going to be a whole lot of flexibility, considering
Absolutely
Kyrie
not.
and Luka are going to be, two big max contract guys on the same team.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. My analogy for Dallas is kind of like a cooking recipe, right? They've got, the basic ingredients, the salt, the pepper, the stuff like that, but they're missing the spice, they're missing the entire recipe. It's like a page of a recipe ripped in half and you don't know what the other ingredients are, but you just don't have them. Like I could see them going out and getting somebody around like Kyle Kuzma. I don't know, if that works money wise, but somebody like that, a big wing to help them because I don't know, they were just horrendous on so many fronts. Offensively, I wasn't too scared for them. And it's kind of similar to Kevin Durant and Devin Booker, where it's like we haven't seen, I don't think, a great sample size of what Kyrie and Luca can do. I think I want to see more of that. So, I'm intrigued to see how that duo does in general because I feel like it wasn't horrible. I think those guys played generally well. It was just overall team play was really bad and poor coaching as well. So I'm curious to see where they go because I was really high on them coming into the season. I had them going pretty far in the playoffs, and then they didn't even make the playoffs due to that abysmal like end of the run of the season that they had. So I agree with you 100%. They are definitely under a lot of pressure because with a player like Luka Doncic, I mean, you should be, I'm not going to say contending, but at least in the playoffs every year because of what he
Yeah.
brings to the table. And it's like, it seems like this Dallas team for 2023 was just such a far cry from what we saw in 2022, where they had some sort of like, they had a set pace. It seemed like they knew what they were doing, and the defense wasn't horrible. It was enough to get by. But now it seems like
Yeah.
they've just lost almost everything that was going good for them. Um, so yeah, and like there's I feel like they have potential to be really good, and they also have potential to be really bad because they do need to get more. I don't think anybody's satisfied with what they've done. I don't even think their own front office is satisfied with what they accomplished thus far in this offseason. Getting the draft pick was great. Derek Lively is going to be a great rim protector, rebounder. He could even, be polished enough to be an inside scorer. We'll see. But they need to do more because I feel like depth and defense is something that's hurting them, kind of similar to Phoenix as well. But they're definitely under pressure. I feel like they're under pressure to be a competitor in the West. Not championship obviously, but at least a competitor. I want to see them in that six six or five seed range, honestly, because I feel like they can do it, and especially if you have Luca, this is the time. And Kyrie's a championship caliber player as well, so there's no excuses. To move on into my next team, this is a team that fell short. You were really disappointed. I was too with the outcome of their postseason. But this is the Milwaukee Bucks, man. They have a lot of issues to address, and I don't think people are talking about it too much. I feel like potentially they could teams can make them sweat in free agency. That's the first thing I'm going to talk about. Then I'll talk about their other stuff. Um, I feel like Middleton opted out of his contract to become a free agent. Feel like that's something that needs to be talked about. Um, and he could end up re-signing with the Bucks, but then also, other rumors that have come up as well. Lopez has been previously mentioned as a possibility for Houston, but I know Milwaukee wants to sign him as well. So there is interest for their guys, and I'm sure those guys want to come back and play and contend. It's Milwaukee. I feel like they're the best team in the East right now. Um, but man, it's rough. It's it's hard to talk about because you know they don't really have a lot of cap space. I don't think so. It's hard to make splashes on like you said, guys on veteran minimum contracts, and it's like is that really going to help you contend? But we kind of have to look at the timeline. They came off a disappointing end to their season, blah, blah, blah. They lost to Miami in a pretty humiliating 5 games in only the quarterfinals. So it's like that's, first round exit is pretty rough. We've expressed, that was a disappointment for sure. And I guess it was like, there was a lot of hype around this team too, because despite how it ended, I guess one of the more disappointing parts of the season was that it, crumbled, you know, post after that deadline when, they got the acquisition of Jay Crowder. That was something that everybody was talking about, like, okay, well, now they've even bolstered up their depth even more. And then
Right.
now it's like they need to make some changes. I think that's something that definitely needs to happen. They started with Coach Bud. So they do have a new head coach, which is a positive, I guess. There's been times where we've questioned his coaching judgment and whatnot. There's only like a few players who've been like rumored to be trade candidates that the Bucks could even like consider, I guess. And any trades for like a win now, I guess would be like what Grayson Allen, like Connaughton, second round picks. I mean, that's kind of like who's really gonna bite on that. You know what I mean? So and who are we targeting here? Um, and I feel like more, I guess, seasoned front offices or more ambitious ones might even go like the extra mile for like Bobby Portis, somebody like that, or even a first round pick in like 2029, I think is when they have their next pick. So that's a long time from now, They don't have a lot of options in terms of what they can do here. And I mean, like to look around, I guess their targets would be like Bojan Bogdanovic. I mean, that's somebody who I guess was linked earlier in the season, but
I guess as a trade.
yeah, cause yeah. Sorry to clarify, that was for a trade, and cause I know I'm kind of circling back to earlier rumors in the season. They were trying to get rid of that first round pick in 2029, for Bojan, but that didn't kind of work out. But I feel like they could circle back to that. And then funny enough, another Bogdanovich, Bogey, feel like that was another guy that we mentioned a lot as well. Um, so they have potential to move that pick, but at the same time, when you have a player like Giannis, I feel like, and you're in the East, you need to be the number one seed. You need to be going to the Eastern Conference Finals. And, you expressed that it was a failure. And, I don't want to, backtrack on my words, but looking back on it, it was really bad.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're going to be horrendous at all. I think we may see
No.
a step back from what they did this season, just due to the fact that they have a brand new coach. Normally, you don't see brand new coaches have as good of a season as the previous regime did. Um, but yeah, looking forward, I know like they've also talked about getting Derrick Rose. It's just hard to mention these people because if you look at it, what kind of impact are they really going to have on this roster? I feel like the biggest topic is definitely um, Chris Middleton and what they do with that because we've seen them win without him. But at the same time, you also feel like you somewhat need him because without him, they don't win that championship when they did. So they have a lot of questions to answer. And I feel like once they answer those questions, we'll be more clear and, decisive on where they stand. But they do have a lot of pressure because, to go out in the first round is abysmal. You can't have that happen as the number one seed to go out to the 8th seed. They need to prove that this wasn't, that this was a fluke. They need to prove that that series was a fluke. We do have to factor in the injuries with Giannis, them not having Middleton. Sure. But at the same time, you did have Giannis in a few of those games and you still lost. You had some pretty poor performances in the fourth quarter in general. Couldn't handle the ball, couldn't even get to the rim and get really good shots. And that's against Miami, who is undersized. So keep that in mind as well. Um, Overall, though, Milwaukee needs to be better for sure, and not even in the regular season. Honestly, I don't care about what they do in the regular season. I care about what they do in the postseason. So if they get eliminated again, um, yeah, then there's going to be some issues. But I think for them, I'm not going to say it's championship or bust, but I think it's pretty much finals appearance or bust, in my opinion. So that's kind of where I stand on
Yeah.
Milwaukee. I think they're under a lot of pressure, and so is Giannis too. Giannis too, even though he did win the championship, he has the MVP, but there's work to be done, and I think they're on the right track, but at the same time, they don't have a lot of room for to even make moves in general. So I'm curious to see what they do.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of with you where like, yeah, they definitely need to kind of show that like you said, the last season, was just kind of a weird bump in the road, which I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it was. I do think that they are a championship or bust type of team, even though it
Sure.
doesn't feel like it, because again, you have a guy that many people, believe is the best player in basketball.
Right.
Um, but obviously, in terms of championship or bust, it starts with what do you do with Middleton and Lopez, right? Ideally, you bring those guys back, right? Because again, you don't have the means to replace them if they go.
Right.
Even in a sign and trade, you're probably just not getting back equal value. Like you said, we did see them many times this season win games, in the regular season without Chris Middleton.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like in the playoffs, to go as far as you can go, you need him, right? Because the year before, right, he was gone against the Celtics, and I think if he had played in that series against Boston, they would have won.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my guess is I feel like they're more likely to come back than not,
Sure.
at least because again, like it's going to be interesting, right? Because I do think that there are a lot of teams that would want Brook Lopez, even though he is an older guy, just because again, he brings a lot of value as, a big 7 foot guy that can, space the floor, and protect the rim,
Mm-hmm.
right? He was like what runner up for defensive player of the year or,
Yes.
very close. I mean,
There's interest in him. Houston, LA, a lot of teams have interest in him.
yeah, exactly. So I think that there are a lot of teams that would want him. Milwaukee, because he's been there for a few years, they can give him the most money. So
Mm-hmm.
if they bring him back, they'll probably just give him like a huge front loaded, contract for like a few seasons or something
Yes.
like that. Um, but again, Middleton's kind of also another, like I said, another interesting case, just because again, we know when he's at his best what he can do, but he just hasn't been at his best for a while, right? So and now he's in his 30s now. I believe he's 32,
Mm-hmm.
or approaching 32 in August. So, I mean, he's kind of at a point where, how many great seasons is he going to have, especially now that he's had, again, a ton of injuries, including some surgeries.
Yes.
Um, but either way, for them, right, because again, you hired a new coach, right, and you had some guys, right, that they acquired, through buyouts or trades, and they didn't necessarily help out that much in the playoffs, right? So they have some other decisions to make there,
Yeah.
right? Like Joe Ingles, that was a guy that they signed in free agency. I can't remember if it was a 1 or 2 year deal, right? But again, come playoff time, didn't help out too much, just because again he's an older guy, wasn't necessarily bad, right? But you watched them against the Heat, and they just had nobody that could guard,
Right.
Jimmy Butler, right?
It was a
Ingles
1 year
couldn't really
deal, by
do
the
it.
way.
Yeah, exactly. So he's a free. That's what I thought. So he's a
Yeah.
free agent. So does he come back? Maybe, but maybe not. Crowder, does he come back?
Right.
Probably not.
Yeah. No.
Um, yeah, Wesley Matthews again, another really old guy. What do you do there? So that's something that I think they need to factor in. Probably get a little bit younger.
Mm-hmm.
And target some wings in free agency because again, Chris Middleton's gonna miss some time. So why not have a guy, that can kind of just at least, in the regular season for spot, kind of replace him. But I don't know, because again, it's a tough conundrum because you still need him at his best in order to win. But
Right.
I guess the question is his best kind of gone? I feel like if he has a healthy off season, he should be fine, right? Because I still don't feel like he's at an age where he should be getting worse. But at the same time, is he going to get better, right? Because if he starts to, if he's actually slipped and he's just not the same guy anymore, then that really hurts Milwaukee's ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, we know Giannis, is one of the best players in basketball, right? But he still has some weaknesses, come playoff time, that we saw right against Miami, right? Again, you saw the issues in terms of not being able to really hit shots from the outside, right? The free throws were really a problem against Miami, because again, I think in the closeout game, I think he was like what 50% from the line, on a ton of attempts, and
Yeah.
again, like we've seen games where he's also shot great from the line, but just in general, we know there are some weaknesses to his game. That's why you have Holiday and Middleton,
Mm-hmm.
as guys that can handle the ball and create offense. But
Absolutely.
I just think that there's some questions there in terms of like those two guys are also older. So how many great years do they have left? And if they start to slip, right, then that definitely lowers Milwaukee's ceiling. And, maybe that necessitates the possibility that a trade comes. And you
Right.
just have to factor in with Giannis, right? What does he want, right? Because, if Milwaukee starts to slip and, like you said, has another disappointing season, right, does he want to continue to stay there? Maybe he does, but maybe he doesn't. So that's kind of something that you have to factor in as well, right? Obviously, it's not the same as, a Dallas because, like you said, they already won the title. But, Giannis is clearly a guy and is a caliber of player where you should be competing every year, right? It
Right.
shouldn't just be kind of like a 1 year thing that happens and then, you're not in the discussion for the title. after that, right? They've been in the discussions, right? But again, they've only won one playoff series since that title.
Right.
So, and again, a lot of it's been bad luck with injuries. But still, they got to figure out some stuff because again, Giannis, like Luca, he's another guy that's too good, for your team to go out, that early in the playoffs, and it's doubly bad when you had the best record in basketball.
Exactly.
So, like I said, target some wings, see if you can get some more youth in there. We'll see what Adrian Griffin, the rookie head coach, can do.
Right.
But I feel like they should, if they're healthy, they should have a better postseason. I don't see them losing in the first round again. I feel like that was just kind of a little fluky where it's like again, Giannis was hurt, Middleton had injuries all year. And again, that always happens in the playoffs where somebody, has the injury bug and it doesn't work out. But,
Right.
again, when it happens to your team, right, at least you can have some level of excuse. But, again, that can't happen again.
Right.
Hopefully it doesn't in terms of injuries, right? But you can't have another year where you go out early, once more. You gotta at least get to the conference finals again.
Yes,
Right? Because
I agree.
Milwaukee now elevated to, one of the favorites every year, right? When, you know, for a while before they won the title, they were kind of trending towards being looked at as a regular season team. But we saw them,
Absolutely.
yeah, but we saw them win a title. But last year kind of felt more so like the Milwaukee teams we saw before the championship. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. Like I said, you got a new head coach, you got some questions to make and to answer in the offseason. But I think they should still be fine. But there's definitely a lot of pressure there.
Yeah.
Just because again,
Huge.
you have a guy that many people feel like is the best player, right? Maybe some people are more off of him now because of what Jokic did, but I still think there's a discussion to be had for Giannis being the best player.
Absolutely. I feel like Milwaukee's probably the team in the East with the most pressure on them right now, just because they're the best, and they
Yeah.
fell short.
Right. And so moving on to my next team, which is another Eastern Conference team, one that similar to Milwaukee had a disappointing postseason, not quite as rough, right, but
Right.
still, kind of, unfortunate, and that's the Philadelphia 76ers. So, obviously we know with them, it's another early exit right in the second round for the Sixers, right? Losing to the Celtics in 7 games when they were up 3-2 at home in game 6, right, going into the fourth quarter. And then from there, it just kind of just fell apart. And then you go to game 7, right? It's a competitive first half, right? But you just knew that Boston was probably going to win that game, right? Embiid had a pretty lousy game. Harden had a really lousy game where it just kind of felt like they just sort of just gave up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, quit on the team, quit on the coach. Doc Rivers was obviously let go, replaced by Nick Nurse. So now they have some real questions, right? Harden's a free agent. We know he's looking for a big max contract, but he's also a guy, that's kind of long in the tooth at this point, right? We know. I mean, he's basically going to be, I think, 35 or 34 this offseason.
Right.
End of August, right? And he's kind of like the main free agent guy, right? That they have to figure out. But again, you have to factor in because of his age. He's had some injuries now, so what does he look like? If you give him a long-term contract, what does he look like after the second year of the deal, right? After
Right.
the third year, of the deal, depending on if it's like a 2-year deal or a 4-year deal, we'll see. Um, but they definitely have a lot of pressure, right? Because again, Joel Embiid won MVP. And then again they followed that up with a disappointing postseason. Um, so there's a lot of questions there just in terms of that duo, in terms of that core. Tyrese Maxey, obviously, he's, had a pretty promising start to his career.
Absolutely.
Tobias Harris has been a fine player, right? But at the same time, because of his contract, I feel like he'd be looking for a little bit more. His father on the Business of Sports podcast, kind of called out Philly saying that he's not being utilized properly as a
Right.
quote unquote assassin scorer. So it almost kind of feels like maybe that relationship might be ending at some point. Um, but like I said, there's definitely a lot of pressure there because again, 52 and 20, or excuse me, 54 and 28. So really good regular season, obviously up and down at different points, but still you were third in the Eastern Conference, right? And then you just kind of just fell apart in the playoffs. And again, that's something that if you're Philly, that it needs to be changed. That needs to be fixed. Because again,
Mm-hmm.
you got at the top, right? You have a guy that again was the MVP, right? A guy that's considered in the discussion for one of the best players in basketball. So this is another team where it may not feel like it, right? Because I feel like even with Embiid being an MVP guy, he's still not like discussed quite as much as some other superstar players.
Sure.
But he's still a guy again that should be good enough where if you have a good team around him, you should be competing,
Okay, yeah.
in playoffs. But it just feels like it's probably not going to happen. But either way, right, there's still a lot of pressure because again, if Philly kind of continues to disappoint, then you're kind of at a crossroads where does Embiid potentially ask for a trade, and then you blow this Philadelphia team up, right, and then again you're kind of in a weird spot where you're going to be a basement dweller for a while.
Right.
So I feel like there's a lot of pressure there, and again, for pretty much everybody, right? Like Nick Nurse, he won a title, obviously, right? But obviously, he's replacing Doc Rivers, so people are going to see, is he that much of an improvement over Doc Rivers, right? Obviously, there's going to continue to be pressure on the Stars, right? Assuming they both return next season, because those are two guys that haven't won a title, right? That have a lot of fans that feel like, hey, they're good enough to be in that discussion for guys you can win a title with, but we haven't seen it yet. So there's a lot of pressure for pretty much everyone across the board. So I think even though people don't rank them as high as Milwaukee and Boston in the Eastern Conference, I still feel like there's a lot of pressure because again, you have an MVP caliber guy who just won MVP on your team. So that's got to be a team where every year you should be competing. And you just can't go out like that the way they did in Game 7, right? Because again, like you can just play poorly, but it just felt like they quit, and you
Yeah,
just
they
shouldn't
gave up.
quit. Yeah, yeah, you just shouldn't quit in a Game 7. Especially again when there was a realistic possibility for them to win the series. We didn't think they were going to win the series, but they had a chance. They were up 3-2, right, and had a lead going into the fourth quarter
Right.
of that Game 6 at home, and it just again it fell apart from there. So I feel like there's a ton of pressure with this team.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I'm not a guy that is riding high on Philly at all. I have them, in that tier, more so in the Cleveland tier. Um that area. I don't think they can really compete with Boston and Milwaukee just due to the fact that that roster construction is so odd to me. You and I addressed that early on in the season before the playoffs. We were like, yeah, like come playoffs, they really don't stand a chance against teams in the later rounds because they just don't have enough depth. I think it's a poorly constructed roster around Embiid. If you want me to be honest, I'm kind of known as the Embiid hater, I guess, but I do enjoy some aspects of his game, and you can't argue with the stats and his impact on the game. But then you look around and see who he does have around him, and it's like, does Tobias Harris really fit his game? Not really. Tyrese Maxey, I think he does. Harden does as well. But outside of that, nothing else really, in my opinion. And you even saw it with Ben Simmons. It's like he didn't really even fit Embiid's game all too well. I feel like Embiid needs a ball dominant young scorer. That's why I'm really high on Tyrese Maxey. But they do have some problems to address for sure because over and over and over again, we're just probably going to see them just get eliminated in that second round until they make some almost an overhaul. And I feel like they're in a different position than Denver was, a few years back. I feel like they can't be patient just due to the fact that this roster clearly has some huge limitations on it. With Denver, it was more so, okay, we can develop these guys. They'll grow into their shoes. But with these guys, it's like, okay, you have Harden, he's older. It's like, okay, you know what you're going to get with him. And he seems to butt heads with some of the coaches that he has had, specifically Doc Rivers. So, that doesn't seem like it's, a winning fit in my opinion. So until they move on from that and get something valuable in return, or Tyrese Maxey makes the somewhat of a Jamal Murray step up play, I think, they'll be stuck in that second round exit spot for as long as this roster is the same. And, it's kind of similar to, the parallels are kind of crazy in terms of what we're talking about. You were saying about Milwaukee and how they were a regular season team. And then, for a long time, and then Giannis kind of asked out, and then they stepped up, um, and then won the championship. Or not Giannis asked out, but there were rumors that he was trying to leave. He was visibly disappointed with all of their exits and their lack of
Right.
success in the playoffs. He wanted to win. So hopefully that, you know, um, that uncertainty of Embiid pushes this team to be better, pushes the management to get the help that they need, pushes the coaching staff to be better, and all those things that happened in Milwaukee when they won the title. And then Embiid can kind of get that title and be back on the same playing level, I guess, as Jokic in terms of, where people can rank him. Because I feel like Embiid is definitely underrated and overhated. I'll admit that. Um, but I feel like at the same time, you do have to take into account beyond the regular season, he hadn't really done that much. So, but in terms of Philly's pressure, yeah, they're under a lot of pressure because they're basically playing, third fiddle to Milwaukee. They're below Milwaukee, they're below Boston, but they just can't compete with them. And that's the unfortunate reality just due to the fact of what they have available to them. So that's kind of where I stand on Philly, but they're definitely under a lot of pressure to be better. I think not necessarily win a championship right now. I think in the next couple of years, yeah, but I feel like they also we need to see them in the Eastern Conference Finals first and see them have a good series there where it's like, okay, they didn't just give up or, it wasn't a coaching lapse of judgment or anything along those lines. We need to see them play their best basketball in a, 7-game series in the Eastern Conference Finals. Then I'll be able to say, okay, now we can see, a championship potentially happening in Philly for sure.
Yeah, I think if you can find some more size at that and shooting at that 3-4 spot,
Yeah, it's so rare.
and yeah, exactly. Yeah, because again, Harris, I think is fine, but like you said, I feel like it's just such a strange fit.
Right.
Next to those guys, because you have Tucker, and Tucker's mainly at this point a four, right? But Tobias Harris is also really more of a four than he
Right.
is like a three, right? So I feel like they just don't really have like a natural two-way wing on their roster,
Right.
and that's probably what you would need from Philly, again, as opposed to what Harris provides you. Um, so I feel like that's probably for them the most realistic move that they can make if they're gonna run it back.
Yeah.
Because again, like I don't think you can completely run it back, or else
Yeah.
again you're gonna have a similar result. Because
Yeah.
it's clear, it's like you said, it's not good enough.
Yeah, and they didn't even like do anything draft wise, anything to
But
make a
they
splash.
didn't even have picks. So I
Yeah,
mean,
they
like
didn't
I
have
think
any. So,
yeah, they had the second round one taken away.
right.
So yeah, they didn't really have any young talent that they necessarily added,
So,
except maybe
same
way guys, right?
roster.
But yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, to move on into the final team, and you can kind of see the trend. We're kind of leaning towards contenders here. And that's Boston. And I kind of want to start off with a narrative thing with Boston. I heard this on ESPN earlier. Basically, the question that was posed was Boston Celtics' decision to trade for Kristaps Porzingis an admission that they were not a championship caliber team? And I'm gonna be honest, I think it was. Um, and you can kind of see it in the fact that they did they got rid of Marcus Smart, right? And that's somebody who's been there for a long time. They clearly, I'm sure, it paying them to do, and they were probably sitting on it for a while, but they clearly decided that they needed to get better at a certain position, and that was big man. I think that was something that they, weren't the strongest at. If you look at who they had, it was Al Horford and Robert Williams, and it's like, okay, I mean, you can get by with that, but are you going to win with that? Maybe not, especially compared to who you'd have to go up to, against in the East, and then say you would get to the finals, you'd have to go up against Jokic. Can those guys handle that? Maybe, maybe not. That's kind of where I stand on it. But giving up Marcus Smart in the trade is a huge deal. I think, the telltale sign that they clearly were not ready. And that may be the immaturity, but at the same time, adding Porzingis does give them increased depth, size, and the ability to open up the floor and create some stretch opportunities for Tatum and Jaylen Brown to pretty much work out. But then also, you have to look around at the roster as well. Derek White can definitely step up into a replacement Marcus Smart pretty much. He's younger. And I think we both think a little bit more consistent, and he's going to step up into a prominent role without, being an egotistical guy, and that could potentially benefit the team's chemistry. But at the same time, you lost Marcus Smart, so that's also going to create that void of leadership. And I feel like everybody knew Tatum was not the leader of that squad. Jaylen Brown was not the leader of the squad. Marcus Smart definitely was. He was their voice and face that they used publicly. He was the one that was basically keeping Boston's championships alive in words, pretty much. And accountability as well, because it seems like Tatum and Brown aren't at that spot where they can 100% take accountability like Marcus Smart. But now they do have the chance to do that, and they can, step up and take charge. So that's kind of like where I wanted to start that off with. But looking at their entire depth chart, bigs, now you've got Porzingis, Robert Williams, Al Horford, and then what, like Luke Cornett, I guess. And then wings, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Sam Hauser, Jordan Walsh. Then you ball handlers, point guards, basically. Got Derek White, Malcolm Brogdon, Peyton Pritchard. It's not a bad roster at all. I think this is good. I feel like they could add maybe another ball handler, but, you do have to look at some of the other things that they've done as well. They do have some, guys that are on two-way contracts like JD Davidson. I think he has potential to be a pretty good ball handler as well. Um, But man, oh man, I feel like there's a couple things we do have to address with Boston. They are under a lot of pressure to compete, especially it's Boston. I mean, they're going to get hate a lot, but they're also going to get a lot of love. So Joe Mazzulla, I feel like he had an okay season coaching. I think in the regular season it was fine, but come postseason you saw the flaws and you saw what happened. The Ime Udoka situation really was like a gut punch to them. They lost another one of their guys that was heart and soul. We've said that multiple times. It's kind of like Marcus Smart and Udoka were, the things that brought this team that sense of toughness that we liked. But now that those guys are gone, okay, now they kind of have to form a new identity. So the first issue that I feel like they need to address is definitely the Grant Williams conundrum. They're not in a position where they can, afford to like splurge to retain him. You know what I mean? So like they can't just throw money at him. At least, until they move Brogdon. But I think with Brogdon, the situation is getting worse and worse because now there's injury history coming into it, and that's not good. Um, and I think this is a telltale sign because, Missoula didn't really play Williams at times in the last season, even in the postseason as well. And they can't afford to pay, too much money. So I feel like maybe a sign and trade is something that could happen, but don't expect like a crazy return or something. So that's kind of where I stand on that. And then obviously the Malcolm Brogdon situation, that's another one that needs to be addressed. That initial three team trade fell apart due to Brogdon's injury concerns. So I don't know if he's still technically valued in there. I'm not sure, what they're gonna do with that. Do they just expect him to rehab and be back at it, at the start of the season? I don't know. That's something that it suggests that they do have some issues as well. And then you have the uncertainty with Jaylen Brown and the Supermax. They can put a like $300 million Supermax contract in front of him before the deadline, which is I think what, July 1st.
think
So
so.
yeah, and he wouldn't be able to be traded for at least like 6 months. But you've gotta be better because this postseason was rough. I said from the jump I thought they could get bounced in the first round, and then sometimes they just look way too complacent. Didn't have that sense of toughness. Didn't have the strength to get past some of these teams. And it's like, to go out to Miami, I mean, yeah, they almost pulled off the comeback, but it's like we can't really reward and applause them for almost coming back. We want to see them, take the series. That's what you want to see. That's what we want to congratulate them on. I'm not going to sit here and congratulate them. Oh yeah, you were down, you know, almost a sweep, and then oh yeah, you came back in game 7 and lost or whatever. So it's like there's no point in rewarding that and talking about that. But the potential is there for sure because Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, they can be one of the better duos in the league for sure. Definitely a top one in the East. But in terms of what they can do, I'm not really sure because, do they ponder a Porzingis extension already? You don't know because now you've lost Marcus Smart. There's just more questions, I feel like, bringing in Porzingis, and I don't know if this is necessarily the best win now move. I don't think it's the craziest. We expressed that when the deal first went down. We thought it was a pretty much a uppercase fat W for every team but Boston involved. We thought this was maybe like a W, lowercase W, or like a lowercase L, kind of in that middle where it's like, okay, it's not like too bad, but it's not good at all. So I don't know. It's like Brad Stevens worked so hard, but they did get that return with the second round picks, so you can't be mad at that. But will that address their concerns going into the future and contending? Because I know I'm not going to say their goal is championship or bust, but at the same time, it low key might be because we did see them in the finals against the Warriors, um, and that was with Udoka and Marcus Smart. So now the expectation is okay. Well, you got Porzingis, so now we technically have to be better, right? So I feel like with Porzingis and adding that center that they kind of desperately needed, in terms of skill, Al Horford's okay. Everybody knows who watches the podcast. I'm not an Al Horford fan anymore. I thought he should be learning Chinese, but nonetheless, Porzingis is better than Al Horford. I think Porzingis is definitely better than Robert Williams. So they did upgrade in that center position, but how far will that take them? But they are under pressure to, I think, I'm not going to say finals appearance. I should be, but at the same time, I don't know if they can necessarily get past Milwaukee. That's going to be an issue for me. if they couldn't get past Miami. Um, and they almost lost to the Hawks, almost lost to Philly. So they tend to get complacent, and I think Milwaukee is one of those teams. When fully healthy at full strength with no errors, you can't get complacent against a squad like that. So until they eliminate that, I think their expectation and pressure is definitely probably Eastern Conference Finals. I think they need to. I'm gonna actually say finals. I think they need to get to the finals. That's how I'm gonna put it. Just because they went, during that season where they played the Warriors in the finals. That's how I'm gonna put it.
I think now that Tatum is, kind of elevated to, that top 10 guy. Some people had him as a potential MVP guy this season. So when you're in that caliber, that tier, where you should be, like you said, at least Eastern Conference Finals. But
Absolutely.
like you said, Boston, I think now is kind of in a position where they should be considered like a championship contender team. Not just like a team where, hey, we made it to the conference finals. We're just happy to be here.
Right.
Um, and like it was kind of funny because when they first went down 3-0, right, we were talking about, their offseason like it was basically over.
Yeah.
They tied the series up, right, but they still ended up losing in the series. But regardless, um, we did kind of say that they definitely needed to make some type of move in the offseason,
Sure.
or else they'd probably be in a similar situation, right? Where I think we basically said, do you move Marcus Smart? Do you maybe move on from Robert Williams, right? One of
Right.
those guys. And that's what they ended up doing. They moved on from Marcus Smart. It was supposed to be Brogdon,
Yeah.
which, if Brogdon wasn't going to play, I feel like that probably would have been a better deal. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, but
That's why the
obviously
Clippers
because
declined that.
yeah, exactly. Then the Clippers declined it, which ton of sense. Um, so now, yeah, you're in this weird position where, yeah, you got a better player. Are you really a better team? Um, I guess the main thing, that would concern me is that health aspect, right? Because again, Porzingis had a healthy year last year, right? But that's not really been his thing for the most part. Unfortunately, he's had a lot of, injury riddled seasons.
Hmm.
Right. But then Robert Williams, right? That's another guy where he's a guy where when he's on the floor, he's, incredibly impactful on both ends of the floor, but you
Yes.
just don't see him a lot. So at least at the very least, maybe if one of those guys can play like, 60 games and then the other guy can play like, 60-ish games. Um, I do wonder how it's going to work, right? Obviously, with Missoula, that was definitely a downgrade from Udoka, but they did hire some assistants, so maybe they can improve on that front. But it was definitely very clear, that the team wasn't good enough, that there needed to be some type of change, some type of shakeup. And that's what they ended up doing this offseason. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of pressure there because again, this is a core that's been together that had been together for a long time. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tatum and Brown, obviously there wasn't pressure on them, when they were young guys like, 5, 6 years ago, right?
Right.
But now, that they're at a point where they're not old by any means, right? But they've had a number of playoff series under their belt as well as a finals appearance. So, they're definitely under pressure now as a duo,
To be
as
better.
a core to compete every year.
Hmm.
So and obviously, again, like you mentioned with Jalen Brown, he's going to be signing that, huge supermax, right? 5 years, 300 million or whatever. The following year, Tatum's going to sign another similar-ish contract, I think over 300 million.
Yep.
You'll pretty much be locked into that core pretty much for, forever.
So
So, I
win.
mean, yeah, exactly. So I think with that, there's definitely a lot of pressure there. You just never know because again, sometimes with a lot of these teams, their championship window is smaller than we think it is.
Absolutely.
Obviously you can have a core of 20 something year olds, right? But then, 5 years go by, maybe they're 28, 29, which isn't old by any means, right? But then it feels like the core, is probably maximize what they can do. Um, and I felt like that core as constructed at the time had pretty much maxed out. Um, so I definitely think they needed to make a change. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not it's enough, right? Because they've definitely made, because once you trade for Kristaps Porzingis, right, you're going all in, as a championship contender team. Not that he's like a superstar, right, but he's a guy that's clearly a very good player.
Yeah.
When he's healthy. So I think for Boston, I think they still need to kind of see if they can figure out, what they can do with a backup wing, right?
Yeah.
Just a guy that can come in, for like 10 minutes, right? If one of Brown or Tatum is off the floor,
Because I feel like
because
Grant
that's
Williams is
definitely
gone.
Yeah, Grant Williams, I don't know what's going to happen with him, right? Do you need him as much now that you got Porzingis?
No,
So maybe a sign and trade is probably, the
that's what I
best
was thinking.
situation there, right? Because he probably won't play as much if he stays in Boston. Um, but at the same time, if you're Boston, you don't want him to walk. So I feel like a sign and trade is probably best for that. And see if maybe you can get a wing there.
Mhm.
And then again with the guard, what do you do with Brogdon? Because it feels like he's probably not going to play. And even if he does, he's another guy that you have to factor in, that's going to miss time. Because again, we saw Boston, they even had stretches where, they rested him, and he still ended up, getting some type of injury come playoff time.
Right.
So I think in that regard, there's definitely a lot of pressure there. Because again, like you said, it's Boston. It's one of the most successful teams, in sports. Um, and they have a core of guys that has been in a lot of big playoff games, including an NBA Finals. So they definitely need to,
Get back there.
continue to, yeah, get back there, get back to the finals and compete. Because again, if they just kind of max out at the Eastern Conference Finals, that's a pretty big disappointment.
Yeah.
Considering that when they went to the finals, that year and lost to Golden State. A lot of people thought, well, again, they're still young, so they got plenty of years left, but maybe they don't. So I
Who
think there's a
knows?
lot of yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure, or else if they don't get it done this season, then there may be even more change,
Yes.
um, you know, coming after that.
Yep. That's pretty much what I was saying.
Yeah. Um, so now for my final team that's under a lot of pressure, I'm gonna pick the other Los Angeles team, the Clippers.
Okay.
So
I like where this is
I think
going.
with them, yeah, exactly. So I think with them, again, another first round, exit. Well, not another, right? But a first
Yeah.
round exit for them. Obviously, a lot of that was due to injuries. Because most people picked the Suns to beat the Clippers going into the series because we knew Paul George wasn't going to play.
Mhm.
But they definitely gave them, a battle, even though it was a 5-game series. They gave them a battle. And if those guys were healthy, they may have potentially won. But at the same time, every year, right? They've basically, one of Kawhi or Paul George has missed significant amounts of time, for one reason or another, and that's pretty disappointing considering, what this core was supposed to be, when they first played together, right? When you look at that core, right? You look at Kawhi, right? The first year they played 57 games, right? Now I believe that was the bubble year, so it wasn't 82 games; it was like 72.
Right.
Um, and then the next year, right, 52 games, right, out of 72. And then the following year, right, he tore his ACL in the playoffs, so he didn't play at all,
Right.
in the 21-22 season. And then last season, plays 52 games in the regular season. And then again, right, gets hurt in the playoffs, tears his meniscus.
Right.
Um, again, you look at Paul George, right, kind of a similar ish thing, right? The 2020 season plays 48 games, right? The following year plays 54. And then 31 games and then 56 games after that. So it's just been, one after the other, both guys kind of taking turns missing games, for different reasons, right? And, it seems like a lot of people have been really frustrated, more so with Kawhi, because it feels like, with him, it feels more so like at times he's kind of just sitting out, unless he's 100%. Whereas Paul George, it's a little bit different with his injuries. Um, but at the same time, right, both guys now are in their 30s. Paul George is 33, right? Kawhi Leonard is 32. Um, so I mean, like, you're kind of at a point now where you probably don't have many more years left,
Right.
right? Obviously, they're also one of the highest spending teams, right? We know the CBA. The CBA is going to hit them hard, right? Harder than most teams because they're one of the highest spending teams. Um, they also have the other factor of that new arena, right? In a year or so, where they're going to be playing, in a different arena for the first time in a long time, right?
Yeah.
Where usually they've played in the Crypto.com arena. But that won't be happening after
Right.
next year, I believe. So I think there's a lot of pressure for them and for this core. We've already heard rumors, about the Clippers maybe being okay with moving on from Paul George. But I just feel like you almost essentially have one more year where it just feels like if you can't get it done next year, you're probably never going to do it. I mean, you could
Right.
also argue the season was kind of that as well, which I feel like it probably was. Because it's just, if they're not going to have a healthy season after, 4 or 5 years together, it's probably just not going to happen.
Right.
Um, so I don't know. I feel like this next season, unless they do end up trading Paul George, should probably be the last season of this core together. And if it doesn't work, I think you just got to blow it up. So I think there's a lot of pressure, for everybody involved here. Because again, with Kawhi and Paul George, right, they wanted to team up, together, in LA, but for the Clippers as opposed to the Lakers, right? To kind of show that they can kind of do it on their own, without, the Los Angeles Lakers spotlight, I guess, underneath them. But it just hasn't worked, right? Because again, you look at even the playoffs, right? The first year together, they beat Dallas in the first round and then blow the 3-1 lead against the Nuggets. The next year they do get to the conference finals, which, was the first time in their franchise's history, right? But then Kawhi is hurt. So then
Yep.
they end up not being able to go to the finals. Then the following year, right, they lose in the play in to the Timberwolves and I believe the Pelicans. And then this year, right, they get to the playoffs. Um, but then they lose in the first round, right, with Paul George and Kawhi having spending that series on the sidelines.
Right.
So it's just been really rough for them, every year. You just almost feel like the Clippers are just kind of like one of those cursed franchises that just seems like every year something crazy just happens that ends up having their season spiral out of control. So, I mean, for them, we know the deal with them, right? Obviously, guards is kind of something that they have been looking at to improve, over the years, right? It seemed like they found something with Russ, but obviously he's a free agent. They can't pay him a ton of money, so it's possible he could just go somewhere else, that
Sure.
gives him more. Obviously with the wing situation, right? Marcus Morris was supposed to be, in that trade with Porzingis, but he
Yep.
ended up not getting moved, right? And you look at him, you look at Batum, right? Those guys are older now, right, and just haven't been as productive,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you probably want to upgrade from that, right? Robert Covington, what do you do from there, right? He's another guy, right, that was a popular player, in most people's eyes for a while, but he just hasn't played much for the Clippers. So I feel like upgrading those wings positions, right, getting a little bit more youth in there, probably what you want. But regardless, like I said, I just feel like you got one more year together with this core, I think, or you just split it up. Because I
Yeah.
just feel like if you can't get it done next season, it's not going to happen. I feel like I was already there, but I did feel like if they were healthy, they had a chance.
Yeah.
But
Healthy,
it's
they're
just
amazing.
yeah, but it's again, it's just when are we going to see that? It just feels like we're probably not going to see it.
No. Yeah. That's pretty much where I stand. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but they're eligible to sign, contract extensions worth up to I think around
Yeah,
220 over four
I didn't mention
years this
that.
offseason. So that's
Right.
55 per season. But then, you have to pose the question, is 4 years, 220 million worth giving to one player who missed a whole regular season and two postseasons due to a torn ACL, in addition to the third postseason because of the torn meniscus? And then, you look at the other guy, same money, but a player that has played just 61% of the games with the franchise due to hamstring, knee, elbow issues. It's just a plethora of injuries. And it's like, do you look at that number and say, is it worth it? To me, I don't think it's worth it. Not both of them. I think one of them is cool. I think you can live with Kawhi, keeping Kawhi and letting Paul George walk just because Kawhi has the championship. Um, and you kind of know, I think everybody knows Kawhi's better than Paul George. Paul George is a great player, but I think Kawhi is just one notch above him. So that's kind of where I stand. And I agree. I'm kind of done, I'm kind of tired of hearing about the hype and the what ifs of this team. They need to, I'm not going to say a full rebuild, but do something and get something in return. Maybe some youth or something, because this is not looking good for them down the line. And like you said, it's almost like they're cursed. They just can't win. Especially with these two guys, it hadn't worked out. And even back in the Lob City days, you could just tell like it just was never gonna work. So they may never win a championship. Who knows? But nonetheless, I think there are some issues that need to be addressed, and they're under pressure to make those moves. I think, and become a better roster in general. And I think they're under pressure to move on from this duo. I think that's where I stand on them, and they need to perform well, and then we'll be able to know and gauge and predict where they can go from there. But right now, it's not very far. Second round maybe.
Yeah. So I guess now, obviously we gave our thoughts, on the teams with most pressure this offseason.
Hmm.
So, let us know in the comments, what you guys think.
Yeah,
Because obviously maybe you agree, but maybe you don't agree.
yeah. Maybe there's
And it's
some that we didn't mention.
yeah, exactly. And of course, yeah, because we only mentioned, basically, 8 teams, right? So
Right.
obviously there's always more teams. Maybe we didn't go in as depth on your team, or maybe you have a team that you think shouldn't be on, that should be on the
Right.
list and should replace another team. So just let us know. But
Yeah.
now we're gonna kind of just get into the more rumors and news going on. So obviously, a big one. Today, well, we're recording on Sunday, but obviously you'll be watching this on Monday. But
Yes.
Naz Reid, backup center for the Timberwolves, signs a 3-year, $42 million extension. Um, so obviously, that's kind of big for Minnesota, right? Because that was a guy that was kind of looked at as a potential intriguing player for a lot of teams in free agency, right? But now he's off the board. Now, obviously, we know, for the next few years, you're going to be paying hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're the Timberwolves, right, towards your bigs, right, Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, Naz Reid, and obviously more money's going to be on the way, right, because they're going to have to pay Jaden McDaniels, right, they're going to eventually have to pay Edwards,
Yep.
um, so it's going to get to be an expensive roster within the next couple of seasons, and you just kind of wonder what the ceiling is. Obviously, if you're Minnesota, it makes sense because it also just gives you some flexibility potentially if you are able to trade, one of Gobert or Towns. Um, so it makes sense, right? Because again, he's a good player, and you don't want to lose him for nothing. But at the same time, it's just with Minnesota, that's just rough to be paying so much money, to three guys who all basically play the same position,
Right.
and you can only really have, realistically one or two of them on the floor at the same time. And even when we've seen both of them on the floor, it's rough. Nas Reed is kind of different, right? Because he's sort of got the in between guy,
Right.
right? Sort of like the bridge, right? Because Towns is the guy that can space the floor and can shoot and is really good offensively, right? But as a defender, right, he's not that great. Gobert, obviously, we know is a really good rebounder and interior defender, shot blocker, right? But offensively doesn't give you much. Even around the basket, right, as a post guy. And then Nas Reed is kind of like the bridge guy, right? Because he gives you a little bit of both, right? He can shoot the three, not as great as Towns, and
Right.
he can, defend and rebound okay, but not as well as Gobert. So he's definitely a valuable player to have in those lineups, especially if you want to go really small. So
Yeah.
I think this is a pretty good deal for the Timberwolves, especially on that contract, because that's, a relatively inexpensive deal, right?
That's pretty
12,
low.
13. Yeah, 12, 13 a year. So, where it's possible he maybe gets more from another team. So it'll be interesting to see. And again, it's a relatively thin, free agent market for centers. Obviously, probably before free agency, we'll get into, a lot of the free agents
Absolutely.
coming into this offseason, but it's not great for centers. So obviously, if you're another team that's looking to, make a upgrade to your front court, that's pretty rough, right? Because he's probably one of the better, well, definitely one of the better centers in the free agent market.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good signing. It helps, you know, I'm not going to say Gobert insurance because I feel like there's no way they can really move on from him now, considering the money. But I think it's a great fit. Like you said, now you have three centers that are capable of doing different things. And I think that's somebody who's valuable and a key part of their rotation and has a lot of promise and potential. That's kind of where I stand on it. I think it's a good signing. I don't think it's bad at all. But, you do kind of get concerned with how much money they are paying their bigs. That's a lot of money for just three guys. But nonetheless, he is the cheaper one. So it's a plus for me.
Yeah, I agree. Um, So next up, from Mark Stein, sounds like Draymond Green is most likely going to return to Golden State. A lot of people believe that it's going to be like a 3-year, $100 million deal.
Hmm.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, he's kind of been sort of the heart and soul of the team. Obviously, it was kind of a tumultuous year last year, right, because of the punch with Jordan Poole, right. But now that Poole is gone, and those guys are going to be split up, it makes the most sense, I think, for him to go
Yes.
back to Golden State. Obviously, he can choose, where he wants to go, right? Because at this point, he's pretty much a made man, with 4 titles, defensive player of the year, right? He's going to be a Hall of Famer, but I feel like, probably his best chance to win realistically is to go back to Golden State. Even though again, it's going to be interesting, right? Because again, I don't feel like they have too many more years left of title contention. Um, but I think Golden State also can't afford to lose him because I just think he
Right.
means too much in terms of the defense, the toughness, the passing ability. I think he does a lot of things that you're not going to be able to replace if he's gone, even if you get, a younger guy. So I feel like, this is probably, the best situation for him and the Warriors because he gets to go back, he gets his money,
Yes.
and still gets to compete, as opposed to obviously, he could go to a team like Sacramento. There was rumors of him potentially going to Memphis before they got Marcus Smart. Some people thought maybe you could swap him and Aiton with Phoenix, but I feel like this is probably the best spot for him,
Hmm.
just realistically in terms of his ability to still continue to compete, which I would think is probably what he would still want to do.
Absolutely.
Even if Yeah, and again, as long as he gets paid, I always thought it was probably Golden State, assuming they give him the contract because they can give him more money than anybody.
Yeah. The my position on Draymond, I think, he's gonna be a warrior for life as long as they don't trade him. That's kind of where I stand. I think like you said, he's very valuable. He brings a lot to the floor. His antics are a bit much sometimes, but in terms of his impact on the game, and he's a solid playmaker. People don't talk about that enough. I feel like, he's pretty much their second best playmaker outside of Steph, I think, in terms of, pass IQ, stuff like that, setting things up, off ball screens. He's just a key part of their offense, and I don't think they need to really switch that up. They won 4 titles with it, so if the record ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's kind of how. I mean, like, there's no point in really moving on from him or not giving him what he wants. He's
Right.
proved that he's a contender and a key part of your rotation. So why not keep him? And
Yeah.
to me, I think it's a tradable contract as well. I think it's not like, okay, now we're locked in for life with him, and we can never move him. So I feel like if and when they do decide to move on from him, it's not going to be a hassle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, I feel like they probably had to decide between Poole and Draymond. And it's pretty clear they ended up picking Draymond. They went
You
with the
should.
veteran guy. Yeah, exactly, the veteran guy. Over the youth, which again makes sense because again he's been a part of 4 title teams.
Right.
And again, I just think in the locker room, I think also favoritism I think plays a factor as well. I feel like
Absolutely.
again I don't feel like the veteran guys hate Jordan Poole, but I feel like they love and appreciate Draymond more.
It's kind of similar to like the Boston thing, with Marcus Smart. Like Marcus Smart leaving would be the equivalent of Draymond leaving. That's kind of how I would think about it.
Sure. Um, so moving on. James Harden intrigued by Nick Nurse. Again, we kind of talked about this in terms of, the pressure with Philly, right? I think it's pretty clear, right? It seems like he was kind of a big proponent in wanting Doc Rivers gone. Again, I don't think Rivers did a great job.
Right.
But again, it adds to the pressure if you're Philly to win, right? Because now you've got a new head coach, presumably one
Championship
that
coach too.
yeah, championship coach, similar to Doc, right? But presumably one that's will have a better relationship with the stars. So, again, I think that continues to add to the pressure of Philadelphia to continue to compete.
Yeah. That's pretty much where I stand on it as well. You know, in my opinion, I think the Harden to Houston stuff was a big load of baloney. I think he's going right back to Philly. I mean, there's nowhere else. So yeah, I think obviously, Nick Nurse would pique Harden's interest because that's going to be his future head coach. That's kind of where I stand on it. And Nick Nurse is not a bad coach. I think he just lost the locker room, and unfortunately, that happens sometimes, especially when you have guys with egos. So I'm curious to see how Harden's ego is going to match up against Nick Nurse and his more so like level-headed approach.
According to Jonathan Feigen of Texas Sports Network,
Hmm.
uh, so it seems like Houston is interested in a couple of guys, including Jordan Clarkson and Rui Hachimura. Um, like I said, these are the type of moves that I think make a little more sense for Houston, right?
Absolutely.
More so than the Kyrie and Harden thing, because I just feel like again, I just don't feel like those guys are guys that you really want, around
Right.
a bunch of young guys. Um, but I think something like this, right, where you're getting, veteran guys. I guess those guys are still Hachimura is still relatively young, right? But
Sure.
they're both guys, that have been around in the league, for a little bit. And I think you'd rather want to do that if you're Houston, than just give your money basically, to again James Harden or Kyrie, because again, it's not a great free agency class anyways.
Right.
And so if you're not getting those guys, you kind of almost have to. Um, chase after the veteran guys. Even if it was like a Middleton or somebody like that, I wouldn't like that if I'm Houston, just
Yeah.
because again, like
Age.
yeah, exactly, age. I just feel like again, getting veterans, and just loading your roster with some more accomplished veteran guys, right? More adults. I think that's more so what Houston needs than
Yes.
like just a talent like Kyrie or Harden. I understand with Houston because they don't have their first round pick next year, I believe. Like they're kind of in a position where they have to be a competitive team next year, right? They
Right.
can't be one of the worst teams in the league like they were this year, but still, I think that this is a much smarter move than what we had heard, before. Because the Harden thing, for a while, I think we first definitely thought it was, kind of BS. And then it felt like it was more and more likely, right? But now in the last month or so, it just doesn't feel like it. Because like I said, I think if they had gotten the number one pick, there would have been a real shot. But I think with them dropping to four, right? I don't think I just don't see it. And I think also with Houston, I just feel like now they kind of are seeing like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And now that they've drafted Amon Thompson, I think that kind of somewhat eliminates, um what speculation there was with Harden and Kyrie coming coming to Houston. I think that's kind of gone out the window. And I feel like Jordan Clarkson and Rui Hachimura would be great fits. Rui's a rare wing, one that can shoot, space the floor, but also can have an interior offensive presence as well. And then Jordan Clarkson, obviously, great ball handler, can pass a little bit, crafty finisher. We know what these guys are, and that's kind of what you want. You want somebody who's not going to be crazy expensive, like Middleton or something like that. You want guys that you can, potentially build around. And, like you said, Houston's not in a position like the other teams. They don't have certain picks coming up. So they kind of have to be better than they were this year. And I think, by doing, targeting guys like Rui and Jordan Clarkson, that tells me that they're on the right track.
Yeah. So moving on. Um. So Suns want 3-team 8 and trade. This comes from the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting. Basically, the idea of like, Aiton going to a third team and Tobias Harris probably going to Phoenix. Again, I don't know how much legitimacy there is. I'm not saying
Right.
that the report is false. I just kind of wonder, what that third team,
Yeah, I'm curious too.
would be. Especially, again, because I feel like if you're Phoenix, I don't feel like Tobias Harris, is again like
He's
the
not the
type of player.
answer.
And again, not at all a bad player. But I just feel like you probably would like a more defensive oriented, forward as opposed to, just another scorer, right? Because I
Right.
just feel like, having basically like 4 or 5 scorers in the starting lineup, right, that all kind of need the ball. I don't know. I feel like you need at least one guy out there that can defend, at a pretty high level that's not one of your stars.
Right.
Just because of the combination of the load they'd have to carry. So, I mean, I don't know, because we also heard stuff like say from Chris Haynes that Phoenix wants to keep Aiton. So
Right.
I feel like, there's probably some answer in the middle, right? Where like if they can trade him for something, they will, right? But at the same time, like it's not the end of the world if they keep him. But I
Mm-hmm.
also feel like they still would ideally like to move him,
Yes.
just because I think that they kind of realistically understand. Yeah, we have the 3 other stars. We probably don't need like a top tier big man, right? We could probably get away with like an average one. But at the same time, you also don't know because he's still a decent, he's still a good player, even though he,
Yeah.
has, been kind of a disappointment, the last couple of years. But, I don't know. It's kind of a weird spot to be in, for both sides.
Yeah. If they can finagle it, I think they would do it. But if
Yeah.
they can't, then it is what it is. That's kind of how I look at it.
Another Mark Stein rumor, the Atlanta Hawks want Pascal Siakam. They've been trying to trade for him. We kind of heard about that a little while ago. I think we kind of heard that leading up to the draft.
Yeah.
Chris Haynes kind of put out that Siakam wants to stay in
Right.
Toronto, like
That's what I
basically
heard.
like kind of putting out that if a team were to trade for him, he may not stay. Which again, I feel like I don't normally hear. Um, usually like a guy will be like, these are the teams that I will resign with, if you trade for me. Not
Right.
usually like I won't resign with a team if I get traded, but
Right.
who knows what's kind of going on here? Because again, with Toronto, they're in a weird spot where they're not really good enough to contend or compete. But they also have like some guys where like, you probably don't want to just trade every single player on the team.
Right.
Like say Scotty Barnes. Maybe you keep Siakam, but I don't know. At the same time, like, with his age, again, not at all old, right? But, maybe you might want to send him away to a contender, to kind of start like a true rebuild, right?
Right.
Like, because again, you also have other guys on the roster, right? Like Fred Van Vliet, right? Where he's a free agent. Kind of have to figure out what you're gonna do with him. Do you re-sign him or do you let him go? Is it a sign and trade? I don't know. So there's definitely a lot of questions for Toronto. And for Atlanta, it kind of makes sense because, again, they gave up picks for DeJounte Murray. And I think they realized that was a mistake, not to acquire DeJounte Murray, but just like, to give up all those picks,
Right.
because now you're kind of in a position where you're basically forced into, having to compete and contend.
Right.
So you almost kind of have to like, make those, big win now moves because if you don't, right, and you either miss the playoffs or you're a low seed, you don't really get anything out of it. So it makes sense for Atlanta, to look for these type of players. I just kind of wonder if it's something that would actually happen. I just don't know.
Yeah, like it's kind of intriguing. I mean, I feel like the fit would be good, but at the same time, like you said, he said he wouldn't re-sign there, so it's like, well, god dang, what are we doing that for? If you add Siakam to their current roster, does that equal championship? No, I think it equals maybe seventh, seventh seed, maybe sixth seed, something around there. But I just don't think that's a big enough move for me to get on board with the Atlanta train. And that's not a knock against Siakam. I just think, he's better as like maybe I don't know. I just don't think it would work. Just simply due to the fact that you already have Trey, Dejounte Murray. I don't know.
I
You
think
you would need somebody else.
I think your best player would probably have to be better than Trey Young
Right.
if Siakam's going to be your second best player.
Yeah, that's
And
that's kind of what I was trying to say.
yeah, yeah, because like you said, it's not even that Siakam is bad at all, right? Because he
Right.
was, one of the better players for Toronto the year they won the title. But
Exactly.
again, that year he was like their third best player.
Right. That's what I mean.
Behind,
Yeah.
yeah, behind Kawhi and Lowry. So it's just like, you know, he's obviously better than he was at that point, right? But there's still some limitations to his game where you probably don't want him to be the second best player.
Exactly.
And then I guess for the last one, so the Knicks, according to the Athletic, declined Derrick Rose's option, so he's going to be an unrestricted free agent. New York potentially might want to bring him back on a cheaper deal, but there also may be potentially some other teams that could chase after him. So obviously we know with Derrick Rose, right, former MVP, um, age 34, going to be 35 next season. Didn't really play a whole lot this year and didn't have a great season, right? Basically 5 points a game.
Yeah.
Um, so and basically was a bench guy for the Knicks this year. Um, so pretty rough, for him, right? After being a guy, that was still a pretty solid player a couple of seasons ago. So you just kind of wonder if it's maybe kind of like getting towards the end for him. Um, so I guess yeah, to kind of get into that, do you think that there's like a role he can still play on a good team, like or is it probably just kind of the end of the road for him? I guess like does it make sense for the Knicks to bring him back? And if not, where should he go? Right? Because I feel like he
Yeah.
would want to go to a contender, but I just don't know because he also has been with the Knicks, and Detroit, so he's been on these other teams, right, that
Right.
weren't contenders. So I don't really know what he wants. Does he just want to play?
Right.
Does he want to contend? I don't know.
I mean, like, I don't think it would be a bad thing to bring, Derrick Rose into a team. And that I feel like that goes for anywhere. I feel like he can fit anywhere. It's just a matter of you just have to realize you're not getting MVP Rose. You're getting an older Rose. You're getting one that's clearly not as athletic. And like you said, you saw a deep and steep decline in what production levels he was able to even do in New York, and he didn't even play in New York. Honestly, I
Oh,
pretty much forgot he was there until they actually put the camera on him when he came in and they gave him an ovation or something like that. It's a tragic story, but at the same time, I'm not gonna say he's completely done. I feel like he has maybe 1 or 2 years left in him, and then we'll probably see him transition out of the NBA. Um, but no, I don't have a problem with a team going after him, and I would prefer it be a contender, and I think that's kind of where he would probably want to be as well. It's not as similar to the Chris Paul because I feel like the decline and talent discrepancy is still a little bit, larger between Chris Paul and Derrick Rose. But in terms of contending, I think he should be on a contender.
yeah. Like I said, I think like you said, I feel like he could probably like play like a little bit for a team. I just,
Right.
I don't know because again, he wasn't really playing for the Knicks. And you would feel like, in a do or dies, scenario against the Miami Heat, right? If he was still like relatively playable, right? You would think they would kind of try him out, but
Right.
they didn't. So,
Especially because
I don't
quickly
know.
was struggling too. But
Yeah,
if they
exactly.
want to bring him back on a cheaper deal, I wouldn't, raise my
Yeah.
eyebrows at it. I'd kind of put a
I
thumbs
feel
up.
like Yeah, I almost feel like if that were to happen, that's probably just like as a contract to Matt's salary, right? More
Sure.
so than like actually play. Because again,
Sure.
like, again, in the playoffs, like you said, they had a number of guards, outside of Brunson that was struggling. So you probably, so you kind of wonder, like, hey, if he's still like a really, really playable guy, right? How come they didn't play him at all? Was
Right.
he hurt? I just didn't seem like he was hurt. He just didn't play at all.
Right.
Because even during the regular season, like you said, he was kind of out of the rotation, after being the backup point guard for, a while in New York, right? And then he just fell out. He only played, I think, in 27 games this year.
Yeah.
So,
That's pretty much where I stand on that though.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, leave your thoughts in the comments potentially, in terms of if you agree with our takes on the teams, with the most pressure this offseason, and
Hmm.
again, don't forget also to like and subscribe with our videos. So thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you Friday.